dial-up internet, Pokemon, The Matrix, Nintendo 64, and the Fiat Multiplier. The 90s had a very distinct look, being a time for innovation and unapologetic experimentation. Spurred on by the internet and the very idea of the future, it gave rise to many interesting designs and aesthetics. So whether you grew up in the 90s, saw ads like these, or even just have this video imprinted in your brain, you'll likely recognize a lot of the styles today, but maybe not some of the weirder ones. It's hard not to mention Pokemon in a video about the 90s. Towards the end of the decade, the world was plunged into a multiple year-long stint of what was dubbed Pokemania. With Red and Green released for Game Boy in 1996, it marked the beginning of one of the most dominant gaming franchises to date. But it wasn't the only iconic series to be born. Resident Evil, Tomb Raider, Diablo, and Fallout popped out as well, with titles from the late 80s like Zelda and Final Fantasy beginning to gain major traction. I could go on for ages about the unique visuals of these games, from the creative menus to the character designs, but I'm not going to. Instead, I want to focus on something equally as interesting, yet far more controversial. Before the age of mismanaged social media accounts, one of the best ways for a gaming company to get your attention was through print ads. Recently, you might have seen images like these circulating online, showing parts of the PlayStation 2's campaign. You would have found these in comic books, magazines, and posters, highlighting upcoming games and consoles. Having limited space on a page, some of these would get pretty weird in their attempts to grab your attention. You need not look any further than this 2-pager for the Game Boy Pocket. Instead of simply showing the 6 different colours, they chose to feature tongues of varying length and colour protruding from a giant wall of flesh. I don't know much about the reasoning behind this, but I do know that I don't like how long the yellow one is. Equally as disturbing is this ad for the Eagle Max joystick. 2 things stand out to me here: the fact that Drop the Load is in bold, and the fact that some of it is in his mouth. As for the device itself, it looks questionably multifunctional, so we'll leave that there. I found another one for the Pentium 3, which shows a newborn holding a controller with the caption, "Congratulations, he's a gamer," a phrase that hasn't been said before or ever since. With a lot of these, I noticed an obsession with making people's heads larger and centered in the page, creating a sort of fisheye effect. Outside of creative reasons, I'm assuming this was done to channel attention to a particular emotion, forming a connection with the viewer in a similar way to today's thumbnails. Anyway, as you might expect, a lot of these faced controversy and complaints. Returning to PlayStation, in 1996 they created a flyer for a music festival, printed with the words, "It's more powerful than God." This same piece was divided up into small tab-like sections that, conveniently, could be torn off and rolled up into filters for smoking. Other provocative entries show hands holding a PlayStation 2 controller with its 4 symbols etched into their veins. In a similar vein to this was a picture of someone's eye marked by the same. Personally, I wish we still had this kind of adventurous marketing today. While some print ads may have gone slightly overboard, it would give an edge to upcoming consoles that they haven't really seen for quite some time. Still, let me know what you think in the comments. Do you find these effective, disturbing, or perhaps both? It goes without saying, but the internet in the 90s didn't just look different, it was different. A great example of this is GeoCities. Launched in '94, GeoCities was an online service that let people create, share, and browse websites, often categorized by theme. At the time, this was a major move towards democratizing the internet, as it made posting and finding others' work much more accessible. During its peak in the 90s, it was one of the most popular websites on the entire internet, being the 3rd most visited in 1999, behind AOL and Yahoo. Anyway, while making these little websites, individuals would decorate them with GIFs, banners, and messages written almost exclusively in Comic Sans. This led to some really creative and personalized pages, as users put their talents and interests on display. Now, while it was bought by Yahoo and terminated in 2009, along with millions of pages, GeoCities' influence continues to this day. An example of this is the popular aesthetic known as Old Web or Webcore, which has emerged more recently. A lot of the imagery used here comes from archived GeoCities websites, which might then be edited or emulated in new designs. I see a lot of this today in the advertising of smaller clothing brands on Instagram, or upcoming artists. Naturally, this look wasn't limited to these kinds of sites. Online magazines, retailers, and more would all employ the same textured backgrounds and vibrant, clashing colours of text. Now, I mentioned this iconic piracy ad at the start of the video for a reason. Although it debuted in 2004, the visual style of the text and its grimy, distorted animations can be linked to an aesthetic that was very prevalent in 90s media. Broadly, this can be labelled as corporate grunge. Inspired by the grunge music scene itself and propelled by graphic designers like David Carson, it can be identified through its use of rough textures, grainy overlays and glitch effects. You might have seen it on this cover of Coolio's Gangster's Paradise, or even the Half-Life game expansions. It gave companies a way to appeal to younger groups that identified with the style or found the edgier graphics intriguing and alluring. A good example of this is the packaging for Tab Extra, a drink manufactured by Coca-Cola in the late 90s. Looking at fonts in particular, one of the most common is called X-Band Rough. If you can't already tell, this was used for the piracy ad that played at the start of every movie in the 2000s. If you've ever read an I Spy book, you'd be familiar with an aesthetic from the 90s, now called Utopian Scholastic. Spreads like this could keep you entertained for hours, as you searched for an array of obscure items and admired their meticulous arrangement. You might have also noticed that the series shared a visual style with a lot of other media from the time. Mostly oriented around history, science, or some form of education, Utopian Scholastic was synonymous with things like encyclopedias. The Eyewitness books are a great example, a series published by Dorling Kindersley. You may be familiar with the classics like Ancient Egypt, or perhaps the thrilling pages of Bird. Its popularity was also reflected in shops and museums that adopted the aesthetic. Looking at locations like this or this, you can see some similar themes. They look professional, sophisticated, but also intriguing to the younger or more curious. The right term here is edutainment. Naturally, this wasn't only seen across physical pages. As part of the growing digital world, Microsoft Encarta would launch in '93. It was essentially an encyclopedia you could plug in and view on your computer, available via CD-ROM. Importantly, pretty much all of its iterations perfectly capture this style. My favourite example is from Encarta 95, having a start screen that features a giant head made up of sheet music and film strips. You might also spot it on CD covers like Devol's Open Book. Personally, going to school in the 2000s, I loved seeing these designs. If a book in the library had a cover like this, you knew it was gonna hit. The WRX, R34 GTR, Supra Mark IV and the Honda NSX. One thing these iconic cars have in common is their release in the 90s. And whether or not you're a fully fledged JDM fan, or just someone who appreciates what are now the classics, you've got to acknowledge a decade that brought significant advancements and memorable designs to the automotive world. Outside of Japan, we got things like the Dodge Viper, AU Falcon, the McLaren F1, and the timeless Fiat Multipla. Still, the 90s marked a shift to rounder designs that were far from everyone's cup of tea. Where the 80s emphasised boxy, angular and sharp styling, the latter moved towards streamlined curves and rounded edges. So why did they do this? And why did cars start to look like, well, that? The most obvious reason is to improve aerodynamics. By reducing the drag created by the body of the car alone, vehicles could become more fuel efficient, requiring less petrol to move the same distance. At the time, this was made easier by the increasing capabilities of computer programs. With these, cars could be designed with greater efficiency, firmly leaving behind the necessity of physical models in the drafting process. Naturally, these programs meant that the curves associated with aerodynamics could be more easily rendered and implemented in manufacturing. You can see this transition across models like the Honda Civic, going from this in the 80s to an egg with wheels. Promotional material would also take on a very unique look. Almost every car was photographed in front of a sunset or a lake, creating glowing highlights and shadows that accentuated their curves. Over in Japan, there was no shortage of interesting prints. Nissans received some of the coolest, ranging from the Skylines to the 180SX. We all know about the Backrooms, a set of fictional locations stemming from a 4chan post in 2019. Associated images were both creepy and unnervingly nostalgic, eliciting fear and a sense of loss. As a whole, these kinds of spaces fit into the concept and aesthetic known as liminal spaces. I've included these here because more often than not, they depict architecture from the 90s, like malls or abandoned play centres. And if you were young at the time, you probably recall an era when most of them were bustling with life and activity. I believe this is largely why they are so haunting. Seeing a bookstore or a shopping centre you once loved stripped down and in a state of decay is depressing. It suggests that people and the world have moved on, leaving these once busy places frozen in fragmented frames of time. The fact that many major department stores use similar layouts further contributes to the sense of vague familiarity. For example, even if you never went to this specific store yourself, you likely had a very similar one nearby. Turning to this photo of the backrooms, we now know that even it was just a photo of a shop from the early 2000s. Specifically, it was taken during plans for the renovation of a Hobbytown store in Wisconsin. Anyway, you might be wondering why so many malls, those that are still standing at least, ended up in this state of abandonment. What led to their decline, and why do they still look like this today? Well, the answer is pretty simple. In the US at least, the rise of online shopping, economic pressures like the Great Recession, and broader cultural shifts forced the closure of many locations. So while the number of malls in the 90s easily fell in the thousands, today many estimate it to be in the high hundreds, on an exponential decline. Consequently, many places that were once vibrant hubs for socializing and shopping now lie in various stages of disrepair. For those that remain, there's been no real incentive to renovate or update their design, leaving many trapped in the 90s, if only in appearance. Today, there's an entire level of the backrooms dedicated to the idea of dead malls, unsettling liminal spaces with all of their era-appropriate rooms intact, but abandoned. How often do you think about gadgets, gizmos, contraptions, or doohickeys? What about knickknacks and whiz-bangs? What if you had a device that could channel the energy of the sun directly into your testicles? What kind of creatures could you create? It's questions like these that led to a decade that was fascinated with gadgets. You had things like the Sony Glastron, Tamagotchis, and portable DVD players. One of the most notable actually came into existence following the movie Home Alone 2. The Talkboy was a cassette player and recorder, originally designed for use as a prop. Soon after the movie was released, it hit shelves in time for Christmas. Interestingly, it actually faced a moderate amount of backlash. While it was still in stores, some people would pre-record profanities into the device, leaving them waiting to be unleashed on the unknowing buyer. To combat this, they tried changing the packaging, which ultimately wasn't that successful. Nintendo's Virtual Boy is another one of the greats. Essentially, it was a tabletop console that used stereoscopic 3D graphics to create the illusion of depth. It came with its own controller and a thin stand to rest the headpiece on. Over the course of its incredibly short lifespan, only 22 playable games were created. Nintendo ceased production in 1996 and shifted their focus to the 64, meaning it was only available for one painful year. In explaining the cancellation, discomfort when playing and its high price were the common denominators. Wacky Postmodern, or
Wacky Pomo,
was an aesthetic that was popular from the 90s to the early 2000s. Common elements included slime, spirals, cartoons, and a bunch of other whimsical merriments. This was primarily used in marketing and TV, and was quite clearly aimed at children. Good examples are Twisted, the game show, a game from '93, some of the scenes in Spy Kids, and an indefinite number of printheads. Naturally, this style also snuck its way into architecture. Sweet shops, for instance, would make good use of its eccentric patterns and shapes. Katy Mills, a shopping mall in Texas, offers a good illustration of this, with its more abstract and unconventional decor. Even the hanging signs featured red and yellow polka dots. For better or worse, this style has pretty much disappeared today. Towards the end of the 90s and the transition into the 2000s, we saw a lot of these aesthetics grow, adapt, or be left behind altogether. The use of these visuals in educational settings, for instance, would be superseded by things like Frutiger Aero, and many of the grungy or more experimental styles were ultimately replaced by the sanitized, corporate-driven aesthetics of today. Anyway, if there's one thing I can say, it's thank you so much for watching. Consider subscribing if you enjoyed the video, and more importantly, let me know what you think about these styles below. Would you bring ads like these back, or do they belong in the past?
dancing at 16 doing a little dance on YouTube, and for some reason I had an erection.